When Shelli Wiley was murdered in 1985, there seemed to be one clear suspect.
The only problem? He was a cop, and it felt like the cops were protecting one of their own.
But then, 30 years later, the lead suspect was arrested and seemed to admit to the crime.
But again, the case went cold, and somehow it stayed the coldest of cases.
We're doing a full recap of the coldest case in Laramie on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time. Before we get to today's show, just a reminder to check us out on Patreon. It's patreon.com/so-much-crime, so little time. All kinds of fun content there. You get episodes released before they're out in your regular feed, bonus content, outtakes, extended time machines, extra stuff from the question of the week. Dee sings a lot, like a lot.
And also, it's there that you can suggest to us what we could review next. So get on, join the community, become a part of So Much Crime, So Little Time. We appreciate your support. Thank you. Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. Before we start, we just want to give you a warning. If you are new to our show, this is an episode where we have spoilers for the coldest case in Laramie. We're going to discuss the whole series in this one.
If you haven't listened yet, check out our preview episode on this show. It's the one before this one in your feed. It'll give you an idea of whether this podcast is something that you want to listen to. You
can also find a link to the coldest case in Laramie in our show notes. All right, let's get to it. Before we jump into our discussion, I just want to remind you of what this podcast is. So, Coldest Case in Laramie was released in February of 2023. It was put out by Serial Productions and the New York Times. The host is Kim Barker. There are 8 episodes. Each one is about 20 to 35 minutes or so in length.
In our preview episode, we discussed episode 1. This is where we heard about Shelli Wiley, a 22-year-old who was murdered in 1985. She was stabbed to death and her apartment was set on fire. Her murder was not solved in 1985, but the lead suspect was arrested in 2016. He was a cop and he was staying with one of Shelli Wiley's neighbours. His name was Fred Lamb. Seemingly, he confessed, but the charges were dropped. We heard about Shelli's niece, Brandy, who pursued the Fred Lamb arrest, pestering the cops and the prosecutor. And we heard about how the murder tore apart the Wiley family. So, Jeff, we've listened to all 8 episodes. You know what? One thing I'd love to start with right now is the host.
Kim Barker, yeah.
Yeah, I thought she was so strong. She was such a strong host. I think there was this turning point in episode 6 or 7 where I realized she wasn't afraid to be wrong. It felt like throughout the start of the podcast, she was very much leaning into Fred Lamb. But she also, towards the end, was okay saying, I did what they did. I went down a rabbit hole on different people, and I can see how they get to Fred Lamb being the only suspect. But also, did he really do it? And also, there's this other suspect that it could also be, and there's nearly as much evidence on him as there is on Fred Lamb, if not more. You could go down a rabbit hole on him, or you could pick apart the evidence you would put up against him. So I felt like she was on the journey that we were all on, where you really feel so convinced about Fred Lamb being, well, for me anyway, felt so convinced that Fred Lamb 100% did this. And then, you know, the last 2 episodes, I was like, whoa, what? Like, where are we going with this?
Okay. So to your point, there's a turn in this series. There's 8 episodes, and in the 6th episode, we get a long stretch of the recordings of the interrogations of Fred by the investigator Terry. And I don't know, I was listening. So that's the episode where you kind of realize maybe Fred really didn't do this. Maybe what we thought was a confession was actually taken out of context. It was taken rather significantly out of context. We talked about this in the preview. We talked about that quote that is in the preview where we hear Fred Lamb basically talk about himself in the third person, saying that Fred Lamb did it and seemingly say that he killed a girl. But then in episode 6, we get the full context of that quote. And it's weird because we're listening to that whole long interview, and I kept waiting. Like, I know it's building to this, but all he's saying is, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. And then he's saying, I don't remember if I did it. And I keep thinking, oh, it's going to turn around, and suddenly he's going to just admit to it. But then he doesn't.
But she did what happened to her, which I thought was amazing. Kim Barker said that's the snippet she had been told about, and she was sitting there waiting for it the whole time. So she went through that whole process. It was like she was trying to give us the experience that she had, and I felt like that was a really strong way to do it. And I don't know. I appreciated that. I appreciated that journey because we're told from the outset, that this is a cold case, and yet we have this random pivot. Like, I think around episode 4, I was like, I get where we're going. Like, there's a lot to cover. I'm not bored, but 8 episodes? And then this sharp pivot that I didn't see happening. And when I say sharp, it's not dramatized. It's not gruesome or slow music and cliffhangers. There's none of that crap. It's all just... it just happens.
It's funny because it's told in a very straightforward, organized way, and yet what you're saying is she took us along on her journey of believing one thing for a long time and following all the threads that point to the same person, Fred Lamb, and then having this kind of hard pivot of, well, maybe he didn't do it, and everything's just sort of crumbling.
But also that she had heard the whole time, she had heard the snippet of him saying, oh, he admitted to it. He said, I killed a girl. But then when she hears the whole context of the interview, she's like, that hits a bit different than I killed a girl, you know?
I did think, okay, so I guess I'm torn on how I feel about that. Because a part of me feels, when I got to that point in episode 6 where we hear the context of how he admitted to it, feeling a little betrayed, a little like it was a bait and switch, like that Kim Barker knew all along where this was going and let us had us spent 5.5 episodes believing that it was just a matter of like convicting him of like that there wasn't enough evidence for whatever reason. It was the prosecutor, it was the cops, all these things. And then to realize that was never where this was going. I both felt misled by it, but also appreciated sort of the cleverness of that. I think in particular, I appreciated that in episodes 7 and 8, it doesn't just end there with saying, nope, he didn't do it. We get 2 full episodes that basically deconstruct all of what came before and challenge all of the statements of witnesses, of people close to the case. And everyone kind of flips in those last couple of episodes. The people either are told what they remembered isn't how it happened, and this investigator is portrayed as maybe he's just an opportunist trying to advance his career. I don't know. That was interesting. I'm a little mad at it.
But do you not feel that what she was trying to do is she was trying to emphasize the complexity of the case, which I think happens quite often. And I think quite often when we're presented with these podcasts, especially a cold case, people, especially a case that was cold for a long time and then it was solved, I feel like people make it out like it was so clear cut. What idiots. They didn't prosecute the right person. They didn't pursue a suspect that is so clearly guilty. I feel like a lot of the time we hear podcasts act as if hindsight isn't like a factor that's playing in here, or developments in technology and DNA and blah 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 aren't a factor here. But what she's doing, or what Kim Barker did, which I thought was really clever and I thought was made for a very strong podcast, was she brought us along on this journey and she said, yes, of course I can see. If I lay all this out for you like this, you are going to say Fred Lamb is guilty. And I'm sure, Jeff, up until at least episode 4 or 5, you were like, of course, this is Fred Lamb.
Sure.
But she's saying, as soon as you dig into the information, it's not Fred Lamb. Like, it's easy. And we've seen it time and time again. And I'm not saying it's not correct in a lot of cases, but it's very easy, especially right now, to say the police were lazy, especially when it's one of their own has a spotlight on them. And I think it's they must be covering up. It's very lazy. Again, I am not saying that there is not merit for that in a lot of cases. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that if you are presented with information, that tiny bit of information, that very narrow snippet, quotes taken out of context, all of that, it's very easy to say, yes, of course he did it. Yes, of course they were being lazy. Yes, of course they were covering up. But what she did is she took us on the journey and said, yeah, but if you look a bit deeper, actually, this is what happened.
Okay. I appreciate that. I respect that. I admire its construction. And I think some of what I was left sort of mad at or frustrated by is at my own, like, myself and the way I went along for the journey. And maybe, I mean, some of the reasons why this case fell apart were things that we've talked about before. Witnesses are horribly unreliable. Like, a lot of the things that this case was seemingly built on are things that we've seen other cases where we know just aren't to be trusted. There was a lot of conjecture and circumstantial evidence and things that just wouldn't hold up, or I mean, just lies told about people and people with prejudices. And I guess I'm also bringing other baggage to this because she comes around to this idea that if Fred Lamb didn't do it, the lead suspect is this guy, Larry Montez, who by all accounts seems to have been a pretty bad guy who did some bad things. But I don't know. I guess there's a part of me that wonders, wouldn't it have been more interesting to have this whole show be about Larry Montez?
No.
No?
No. That's a terrible idea.
Well, if he's the one who really did it, wouldn't we have wanted to get that resolution?
She never said he was the one that really did it. She said there's a very viable other lead suspect. She could do a whole other podcast, I'm sure, on Larry Montez and come back out at the end saying, well, we have so many holes in this potential case too.
I think it's a little bit of my residual baggage from Serial. This is a Serial Productions and New York Times podcast. And I remember finishing the first season of Serial and being so hooked on it, but also so mad at it for asking questions that it couldn't answer and finding Sarah Koenig to be kind of annoying as a host.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a question that my mum asks a lot of the time to me or to other people. Who owns the problem, Jeff? Is this because it's not wrapped up in a neat little bow? And also, we're on episode 54 of So Much Crime, So Little Time. And you're like, oh no, it hasn't been solved. It's not a neat little package.
Okay.
We have had so few neat little packages in the last, 27 episodes.
So first of all, I did already say that part of this is I'm mad at myself because the answer was right there in the title. You alluded to this before. We knew it was a cold case, the coldest case, in fact. If we were going to get a resolution of this, then it would have been a poorly named podcast. So why didn't I read the title and process what that meant? I don't know. I wanted to think that there was going to be a resolution. I always want there to be. I've talked about this before. I always want there to. I know.
Do you not feel duped though that you didn't spot the turn? You know, when they were talking to Fred Lamb, when she was interviewing Fred Lamb after in the last episode, and she said, "Why didn't you call an attorney?" And he said, "I didn't think they were trying to get me. I didn't think I needed one."
Yeah.
And really, he felt kind of duped because he trusted them. And do you not feel that the podcast was laid out for you to build trust with them, that the coldest case in Laramie was going to be very straightforward? It's a cold case. We're hearing about a cop. This makes a lot of sense. Like, it's in a package. She starts off saying how much she hated Laramie. But there are seeds planted throughout the show. But you didn't get them.
She's an unreliable narrator.
No,
she's an unreliable narrator.
you're an unreliable listener.
Both things can be true.
Episode 4. Episode 4. It is noted when they are talking to Angelo Garcia brought Larry Montez up and said, we were at a party and we were looking for Larry because he stole my dad's car. He stole some car. And then we met him again and he was in all these new clothes.
Yeah. No, it was right there.
It
It was
was
right there.
there. It was a seed in there. I feel like what you're feeling right now is that they won. If this was Murder, She Wrote, if it was Silent Witness, if it was Midsummer Murders for any of you based in Ireland or the UK, or one of those crime shows, you'd be feeling, feck's sake, like it was all there in front of me. Now, again, sorry, allegedly, Larry Montez didn't necessarily do this. We don't know that. But what I'm saying is the doubt was there. It was peppered throughout the podcast. And the point is, if you're not looking for it, you will not find it.
Yeah. No, you're not wrong. But
Does
I can
that-
also
Just sorry. Does that mean I'm right?
maybe a little.
You can't say you're not wrong. Like, it's a synonym of you're right.
All right, D, you're maybe right, but also, I feel a little manipulated, and including the opening of the show talking about, like, she starts by saying Laramie is worse than Islamabad, is worse than Kabul, and it's, all of these reasons why it's a horrible, violent place, and then she ends by saying, actually, everyone I met was lovely, and maybe this place is great. And I understand that it was her journey, and that was the journey we were taken along with. I'm just still a little mad about it. I wanted it to be a different kind of satisfying conclusion. I understand it's a cold case. I can intellectually understand that, but emotionally not like that.
I loved it. I loved it. I love that I heard it on total honesty, episode 4. I heard that peppered in and I was like, that's weird. If he came back in new clothes, why isn't anyone looking at him? I think they mentioned his scrapes on his hand, or there was some other thing that I was like, that's odd. And I knew he had been the one who was like going into women's room with the Slurpee. And I was like, this is even interesting that they're going into that detail.
Yeah.
Weird. But I forgot about it until he was mentioned again. So I was not fully duped like you, but I was like, I love this. And again, I shouldn't say that because then I'm the typical white woman who's just like obsessed with true crime and hearing about it. I understand. I get that. But I just felt like it was so clever to have it peppered in, but not laid into, because that is what the police did.
It is what the police did.
That is
but
what her family were seeing. It makes it so understandable as to why her family at the start were like, it's Fred Lamb, it's Fred Lamb. Her friend was like, Michelle, who her roommate was like, I received this card and this is what it said. And we're like, oh my God, if that's what it said, it must be him and blah, blah, blah. And then when you kind of hear it from the other side, it just changes. It's all about perspective.
it is. I think the misremembering of the card. So this was the threatening card that her roommate got, and she thought it basically told her to get out of town. And really, it just was a card with some money. It was like said Merry Christmas in it. In my notes for episode 4, and I have the most notes for episode 4 by far of any of these episodes, I have a line that says, and I write down the names of people so I remember who they are. It just says, Larry Montez, period. Other possible suspect, period. Went to watch sleeping ex-girlfriend. So it was right there. It was right there, and Kim Barker put it pretty plainly in the middle of this whole series. That was near the end of episode 4, so right about the midpoint of the whole thing. But that was also in the same episode where we heard some of the most racist racial profiling by the police. They immediately went to the university, to the black football players, and it got real uncomfortable. Some of the questioning.
Oh my God. Yeah, like there was one that I've written down, and I don't know if I fully got this like word for word, but when they were questioning one of the footballers and they basically said an attractive white girl wanting a black boy, isn't that weird?
Yeah.
Like what? I actually had to rewind that to be like, can I just clarify? Did she like other black athletes? And then at another point, the interview pivoted towards, he was talking to someone who was Mexican, if I remember correctly, and said, like, was very much othering them. and saying, over on your side of town or where you're from. And he alluded to something along the lines of cowboys and Mexicans or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Yep. Yep.
What?
Yeah. And two other things from that episode. One was, well, actually three other things. So
I mean, I feel like there could be 50 other things from that episode.
okay.
I listened to that episode and I kept having to pause it to be like, I need to calm to re-listen because it was so... Yeah, sorry. Go on.
Yeah.
So
one of the things was a stat. 39 men gave either fingerprints or blood samples. So 39 men did that. 25 of them were black or Hispanic in a town where 9 out of 10 people are white.
Yep, I have the stat written down. Isn't that?
So that was one thing. One other thing for that episode, there's Eric Porter. So Alan Griffin was the one who was in some type of, I think, just friends with benefits relationships with Shelli. So we spent a lot of time with him. But there was another football player named Eric Porter, and he initially refused to give fingerprints or blood samples. But then his mother advised him basically, and I wrote down the quote, just, they're not going to stop. You're not going to get away from this just because you're black in this town. You can't get away from this. And then on top of that, what you were alluding to about the relationship with Alan Griffin, there was a lot of victim blaming by the police in this.
Oh my God. She was promiscuous, wasn't she?
She was promiscuous with people of color, which made it even more disgusting seemingly to them. And it would, like I said, it was uncomfortable. And then you go from that episode into episode 5, which is the one on Jake Weidman, who was the one who had killed his roommate. So he had committed murder, and he admitted to murdering Shelli falsely, basically just as a suicide attempt.
Okay, so and this is, I think, where I got very confused because I was like, do you think they were just looking to pin it on anyone? Because he was clearly not a viable suspect.
Well, why? I mean, he definitely wasn't, but...
I mean, his confession was riddled with inaccuracies. He spoke about a fireplace. She didn't even have a fireplace. He spoke about it all happening inside. That wasn't the case with the evidence. Like, it was riddled with inaccuracies that there's no wiggle room for it being, oh, I forgot that we actually then went outside. Like, there was no wiggle room there.
I think, and this is where I have very kind of conflicting feelings about this podcast, because those two episodes, the middle of the show, episodes 4 and 5, you had all of this stuff about these black and Hispanic men being accused essentially by the police, and Jake Weidman, who he offered up, right? He brought himself into this. He wasn't someone that the police were looking at until he offered up a confession. But hearing his story, this young man who admittedly had significant mental health issues, neurological disorder, and which had led him to commit murder and led him to confess to this murder, which he obviously didn't do. And hearing him talk now, more recently, as an older man, he just seems so sound and just like someone who...
Did you say sound?
I did. I know. I heard it as I said it. I sounded like you.
It's a nice one.
He just seemed like a wonderful person who has done a lot of work to improve his mental health and his well-being, but he's still in prison, and he will probably be in prison the rest of his life. He got out briefly, and it sounded like it was a misunderstanding or a miscommunication about what he was supposed to do with a psychiatrist or psychologist. But I wrote down in my notes for that one, why is this man still in jail? Like, clearly he was in a different place and was a different person back then. This guy is going to spend the rest of his life in jail. But I don't know. It's just, I guess it stirred up some things that I have a strong emotional reaction to. And I didn't know, okay, this is maybe too critical, but these stories of these men, they felt a little like props in this larger narrative, in this sort of...
What do you mean?
If I were to reduce what Kim Barker was doing here to some sort of simulation of her journey and some sort of way of saying, look, just because there's someone who seems like the obvious suspect and we have these eyewitness testimonies, hey, I fooled you just like I was fooled. You can't believe this stuff at face value. But what agency do the people within that story have? She's sort of playing this game where there's still this woman who was murdered. There's these people whose lives were ruined or turned upside down by this. Even Fred Lamb, if he didn't do this, I mean, what is his role in this? We spent 5 or 6 episodes thinking this guy is a murderer, and that's not something you just sort of entirely shake. That's still in the back of your head.
But that's how she ends it. She ends it saying, if this isn't solved, and it's so unlikely at this point that it'll be solved, that there will always be a question mark over Fred Lamb. There will always be Shelli Wiley's family who are looking for answers. There will always be people who feel a lack of closure. I sort of get where you're coming from a sense of agency, but at the same time, Jeff, like the point of this podcast is to tell the story. And just like with the Una Linsky case, like the first podcast we covered, it turned into not to be really about Una Linsky, but about Martin Kerrigan. More about Martin Kerrigan, who had been convicted and went to prison for her murder, and it turned out he wasn't. It wasn't him. So just like that pivoted, this show, like the fact of this show is not to give agency to different people. It's to bring you on a journey to say, look at all these different factors that were happening in this small town. And look, when you look in a narrow view, there are all of these assumptions, all of these factors that led to this case being a shambles, and the fact that this case will never be solved. There is no doubt in my mind after listening to this case will never be solved. But what Kim Barker and Serial and New York Productions are doing, they're telling that story, that it's not as clear cut as, well, they think it was Fred Lamb, so it must have been Fred Lamb. There are other things involved in it. And I do think Jake Weidman's case was really important to add in here. And I do think everyone that was mentioned in here was important to bring them in. And I think for Fred Lamb, in fact, I think this was really telling. If anyone has said he's definitely done it and he listens to this and they say, and we hear that even with Shelli's family towards the end.
Yeah.
They're like, whoa, he mightn't have done it. Whoa, my memory is different. Oh, it wasn't him who was talking about the shades being put back up on our window. Oh, it wasn't the card that I thought I got. Like, that was all fascinating.
I hear what you're saying. I think maybe this is one I'm curious to come back to in a while and see kind of how it sits, because this is still sort of fresh. I just finished listening to it yesterday, and maybe I need to sit with it for a while. I have mixed feelings right now.
Or maybe you just didn't like that way. And like this, I feel like it is quite different to how others have been thrown at us. And so I quite liked it. Don't forget to join our Patreon. You'll get early access to shows, bonus content. You'll also support us in making the show, and maybe, just maybe, we'll give you a shout out on the show, and you can recommend a podcast for us to review. Next time, we're going to do something a little different.
We got the opportunity to interview Bill Huffman, veteran journalist and host of the podcast Who Killed? His show is described as giving a voice to the voiceless. It tackles everything from both lesser-known cases to the most famous true crime stories out there.
We'll introduce you to the show with our interview with Bill on Sunday.
Then on Friday, we'll do a recap of several recent episodes of his show. That's the next So Much Crime.
So Little Time. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.